A few weeks ago I found out that my grandmother on my mother's side doesn't have too long to live. We were never close as a family due to issues that involved physical abuse and other smaller items of violence towards my mother. My mother moved before I was born across the country from a seaside town to escape my grandmother's anger and her vice grip control. She moved to a large city, and that is where I grew up and prospered. My mother, in her shock, told me that we would need to go back and see her before she passed, even though my grandmother wasn't the kindest of people. But she was still family, and we would need to sort out her estate and make other arrangements. So, me and my mother got into her car and travelled back to the town that my mother was raised in. However, during the drive my mother began to tell me that she got a letter from her mother's lawyers telling her that the house and the land would be given to her on the event of her mother's passing. Due to my mother being needed in the city due to her high position in her company, she couldn't look after the estate and give it the attention it needed. So, she decided to drop a bombshell and proceed to tell me that she would sign the whole thing over to me, and it would be a great start for my portfolio if I could fix up the house and sell it, as the house could be worth a lot of money if it could be fixed up correctly, and my background in carpentry, I wouldn't have to employ anyone as I could do the work myself. Once we arrived in town, my mother and I travelled to the house where my mother grew up and saw the dilapidated state of the old dwelling. The house seems like it would fall apart if someone even banged a door within its structure. My mother looked physically unnerved seeing her old home. After that short viewing, my mother began to drive on and headed into town. Once in town, she dropped me off at the centre and told me that she would pick me up later once she had finished at the town hall. In other words, once she finished all the legal stuff, and we would go see my grandmother, a woman who I would be meeting for the first and the last time, as my mother kept me away from her due to her violence. Walking around town, I noticed that most of the shops were old and slightly weathered, as each person in town seemed suspicious of me as I was a new face in this medium-sized town. Everyone knew everyone, and I was the stranger. Heading up Main Street, I saw a DIY shop and got interested in some of the tools that were on display. After a while of wandering around the town, for a short while I noticed that the people on the streets kept staring while whispering and pointing at me. Within moments of me noticing all the people staring at me, my mother pulls up in her beat-up old car and smiles as she swings open the door that nearly falls from its hinges. Getting in the car with my mother, we head to the hospice where my grandmother moved to a few months ago and spent some time with her. My grandmother just laid there on her bed and wasn't responding to us when we tried to speak to her. The nurse spoke to my mother outside the room, and I just watched my grandmother lay there as I felt an increasing uncomfortable feeling about being in her presence. My mother then pulled me from the room and looked saddened as she told me that my grandmother is on a machine sustaining her and her brain is no longer functioning, and they asked her to sign the release papers letting my grandmother go. With that said, I felt emotions for my grandmother and nodded, knowing that once the machine was turned off, my grandmother would die. Spending a few more moments together, I just sit there and just speak about my life and how she would have liked the city I grew up in, and how she would have loved the parks that my room looked upon, and in that way, I was saying goodbye to a person I never really knew. My mother tapped me on the shoulder and told me that it was time to go, and we left that room knowing we had just lost a family member that day. It took a few days for everything to be sorted out, and once we were done with all the legal processes, we got the keys for the house. Once I had the keys in my hand, my mother turned to me and smiled as she got into her car, wound the window down and told me to have fun, and with that, she drove away, heading back to the city for work. I knew she was leaving, but I still felt uncomfortable being in a town alone. I shook my head and I started to head towards a local office building that was situated in the old town hall. Entering the office, I looked around and saw ornate designs spread across the hallway and noticed a little woman sat behind a desk. I walk up to the desk and order my grandmother's blueprints as without them I couldn't fully understand the wooden structure of the building. The woman behind the desk just stared at me and handed the plans without saying a single word. The feeling from these women's eyes was that of annoyance, and I just stood there smiling, taking the plans and leaving the office building as fast as I could. Looking around, I saw a little coffee shop and decided to grab a cup of coffee as I looked over the plans. While I sat there in the shop, a lady came up to me and tapped me on the shoulder, asking me if I had bought the old wooden house on the hill. I smiled as she handed me an official-looking piece of paper and smiled again as she walked out the coffee shop, not even looking back as she left. Looking down at the piece of paper, I saw that the woman handed me the town rules, which I found basically silly. The rules were, don't litter, pay your taxes on time, make sure you keep your land tidy. However, the last one on the list made me narrow my brow a little, and it was just in bold saying, stay inside after 10 PM at night. The last rule made me read it at least twice, and to be honest, I thought it was a joke, until I looked at the bottom of the page, and in small writing it wrote, any rule broken will be fined and possibly prosecuted. I drank my coffee and headed to the local hardware store to pick up some basic tools which I had forgotten at home. As I was in the store, I noticed hanging on the wall above the counter were the same set of rules that I had in my pocket. Asking the old man behind the counter what the last rule on the sign really meant, I thought it must be an old curfew from the time of the war, but the old man told me on some nights a fog will roll in and anyone who is caught in that fog will mysteriously vanish. With that said, I chuckled to myself and purchased my tools and head to my new home. I arrive at the house and check my phone and smile as the lumber that I ordered will be arriving in about a day. I entered the house and began to explore and found myself in the basement checking the pipes and the structure of the beams and found that they were surprisingly sound for the age of the building. After checking the basement, I head up to the living room and begin to move furniture around that were kinda rotted and find an old pendant that seemed very old. The pendant had a gold inlay with a sapphire gem encrusted inside it, and I thought it could be some sort of family heirloom and places it on the side where my jacket would be found. While moving more rotting furniture, time began to escape me, and I worked and found most of the living room and the kitchen structure was sound, and all I needed to do was replace the whole kitchen furniture like countertops and sink and cooker, and maybe replace the tiles on the ground, and maybe carpet the living room also. Looking at the clock and noticing I haven't eaten, I decided to head into town to grab myself a quick bite to eat. After getting my food, I begin to walk around town and notice that most of the shops have already closed up for the day. Looking at my watch, it reads 9:30, and I understand most shops closing up, but fuel station and restaurants should be open till at least 11 PM, like all the others I have visited in the area. Then I remember the rules. Shaking my head again as I cannot believe they are adhering to this nonsense. Slowly walking around that disused port, I notice in the distance an old shipwreck that must have smashed against the rocks a long time ago. Looking out to sea, I smile and begin to head back to the house. While walking back, I notice that the streets were completely deserted, and as I look at my phone and notice a small blanket of fog beginning to surround the town. Slowly moving towards the house, the fog seems to follow me through the town, covering each and every part as it seems to follow me even more with a sense of intelligence. Looking at my watch, I notice it was 10:20 and I begin to move a little faster as each time I look back, I notice that the fog has increased in size and speed. I reach my door and slam it shut. As I look through the window, the fog has blanketed the whole town in a thick haze. Watching the fog become thicker and thicker, it spreads through the town like a virus and never really eases up. While I watch from the window, laying down on a makeshift bed I created from the sofa cushions and a blanket from the cupboard, I lay there and begin to listen to the wind howling, and then the rain came. It rained extremely hard, and I thought it was weird as when I was watching the sky seemed clear. But I shrugged my shoulders and drifted off to sleep as the sound of the rain lulled me off into the slumber. The next morning I wake up and notice that down by the road there was a man nailing a missing poster to a telegraph pole. That caused my eyebrow to raise, as last night the strange fog and now a missing person. I head down into town and visit a few stores that I needed parts from, and then received a call saying my lumber has finally arrived at my house. While I walk back, I hear a few locals speaking about the missing person and find out it was a fisherman's wife who had got caught in the fog after walking home from the cove while picking shells for her furniture she makes. Looking over my delivery that was set out on my front garden, I sensed a presence behind me, and when I turned around I noticed that the same haggard woman from the office stood there just staring at me. I asked her if I could be any help, or is there anything I can do for her, and she just stared at me for a short while and then turned around and walked away, which I found extremely weird. But turning round and beginning to unpack the lumber once more, I begin to set it out on the grass in front of me, and once I have confirmed everything I ordered is there, I begin to tear the cladding from outside my house to reveal the inner structure of the home. Once the rotting cladding is removed, the inner wall is given sunlight from what seems over a decade, and I come to find to my surprise that some of the wood that was used to build this home was old wood from ships that were salvaged from the shipwrecks from the nearby rocks. Some of the wood has binding holes running through them, and seeing that the wood was from ships, I don't see a point in removing it, and I just repaired the cladding to go over the wood to make the house seem fresh and updated to this generation. Working all day, I find that some of the locals became interested in what I was doing, and some even came up to me and began asking questions, and some even asked for quotes on their homes and shops, as some of their cladding needed replacing. One of the locals who kept hanging around was an older man who I found out that ran the butcher shop and was impressed with my work, and I took the opportunity to ask him about the missing woman. All I got from him was that she disappeared just off the pier and her husband is devastated from her disappearance. The man turned around and walked away as I continued my work until my stomach demanded sustenance. Walking down into town and grabbing some food, I wander around town until I end up in front of the old town hall and notice that on my watch it said 9:59 PM, and once again the streets were completely deserted once more. Walking around town, I slowly watch as the fog begins to roll in, and I growl in annoyance about this stupid, absurd rule, as if I stay in my house anymore and not get any time outside, I would go insane, as it feels like the house is beginning to drain me of my energy. Walking throughout the town, I begin to see that the fog slowly began to flood in like a slow mudslide as I begin to smell the unusually strong scent of sea air. The fog began to move with an intelligence, as each time I take a new road to head home, the fog drifts over and cuts off my path. As I stand at a crossroad, the scent seems to get stronger as I feel my clothing being tugged at and touched slightly as I turn around and look, and there is no one there as I feel confusion. I get a strong feeling of fear run down my back as each step I sense something rushing towards me. The feeling of the fog isn't a normal wet feeling, but a dry and heavy. As more I walk, the thicker it becomes. Each time I walk, there is a feeling of dread rising in my stomach. Once I reached the butcher's shop, I began to hear whispers in the wind like it was nothing but passing notions. As each time I push onto my home, I feel something gripping at my arms, trying to hold me in one place. As I look to my left and notice multiple shadows standing in an alley, all shimmering and shifting like you would if your image would be distorted by dropping a rock into water, and the ripples distort your reflection back. Pressing on, I push through the thickest of the fog as each step feels like I'm trying to walk in custard. Reaching my gate, I look back and notice a group of shimmering shadows just stood there, not moving and just staring at me. As I turn to face my house, I see a single shimmering figure just looking at me as it lifts my hand and points directly at me. I begin to freak out and dash for my door. I slam it shut behind me as I pant as I slowly attempt to rationalize it in my mind. As I begin to calm down, a pounding starts on my door behind me as I look up and notice the door handle begin to rattle. As I am not a religious person, but I still pray for it to end. Within moments of the rattling starting, glass started to crack above my head as the windows in my door explode, causing glass to rain down upon my head. All I could do was sit there and pray for it to stop, as within minutes of it starting, everything went silent and everything had stopped. I slowly crawled to my living room, and in the process I sliced my hand open on some glass. However, in my panic, I looked through my front window and noticed that the fog has slowly started to descend into town as it sits at the bottom of the hill, hungrily waiting for me to come back down. Laying there on the sofa, I begin to shiver as my logical beliefs begin to shift as I cannot comprehend what just happened. The next morning I get up and walk into the Hall of Records and ask the person once again behind the counter for the history of the town. But all I got was a simple document. On that document was the basic identification of the town's name, the town when it was registered, and a few names. However, on that pathetic piece of paper I found interesting things like the founding names. Also, the names I saw and recognized were my grandmother's names and the names of the few other important people who run the town and have been running the town for over 100 years. I walk out of the Hall of Records a little annoyed, as it seems that the history of the town was being censored in a way that make it seem like the town was like any other town. But other towns don't have misty spirits who try to drag you off into Davy Jones' locker. With my disappointment I head home and open my door, but when I close my door I notice a letter sticking out of the mail slot. When I open it I found a handwritten note saying, "If you wish to know the truth, go to the light that is never lit." And with that I started to ponder on the sender and on the line, the light that is never lit. And I begin to think about what could that mean. I begin to look around town on a map and notice no pub or shop or anything with a lamp symbol that is extinguished. But then I notice in the northern peak of the map is a small outlet that sits a lighthouse that I have never knew existed, as when you stand on the port you cannot see it. With that said, I slowly pack a bag of supplies that I don't know how long I would be out that day. I make my way out of town and head to the cliff face and the cliff side where the map indicated the outlet would be on. Reaching the cliff face I notice a small rundown dilapidated lighthouse that has not been used for a long time. After a short walk and a bit of a climb, I reach the door of the lighthouse and look around. Open the door, it opens with a large creak and a cloud of dust that rushes into my face. Looking up the massive spiral staircase, I notice that the iron of the staircase seems decayed, but if I want the truth, I must ascend the staircase to find the answers I seek. Slowly walking up the staircase, my doubt about this being a good idea is easily shaken as the staircase creaks and bangs as it supports my weight as I climb. Reaching the living station at the midsection was a relief, as I was on solid ground once more and noticed another letter that was stuck on an old news article talking about a shipwreck and many lives being lost. I take the note and open it, and once again I found a handwritten note and another cryptic message. Many lives lost, a single tear shed, one man's greed, let it all go ahead. On that note was coordinates, and with the map I brought with me I found that the coordinates point to an old shipwreck that I noticed the first time I went to the port. Pressing on, I reached the top of the lighthouse and noticed another note was taped to the actual light of the lighthouse, and once opened there was a symbol drawn on the paper that had an annotation saying, "Follow the symbol and the truth will be revealed." I groan at this preposterous and prolonged goose chase and begin my descent down the staircase. Once I reach the door I notice the sun has begun to sink into the horizon, and when I look at my watch it reads 8:30, and I noticed from where I was stood you could easily see the shipwreck which the coordinates pointed at. My next objective is to find what that symbol really meant. Once I reached the town, I felt compelled to head over to the main square and look at the clock once more, not for the time, but for the brick that surrounded it. As I examined the brickwork, I noticed that the symbol that was drawn on the paper was the same as the town's seal. Wondering what the town has to do with an old shipwreck, I walked into the old office town hall once more, and saw that the same woman who was acting strange was sat behind the counter. I walked over and placed the note on the desk and asked if the town is hiding anything, or do they know anything about these mysterious notes. She just stared at me once more with that deadpan face and didn't speak a single word. I left a few minutes later, feeling very disappointed. I wandered around town looking at each building, looking for more clues, until I noticed that I have been out for far too long, as I look at my clock and notice it is 9:59 p.m. And as I see the time tick over to 10 p.m, my heart drops like a rock into the ocean. Looking around my surroundings, I notice a large amount of fog rolling into town like a tsunami blanketing the land. Looking around, I notice I need to get home before it's too late, and I quickly start to weave in and out of side alleys trying to make a beeline for my house. Reaching Main Street, I come to a sudden stop as I notice that the fog has completely surrounded me and has easily cut off my escape. I look around and notice I am completely trapped in this fog, as each time I try and trudge through the thickest of the fog, I feel hands from every direction grab onto my arms and legs, holding me in place. But through sheer willpower I break free and pull myself back into the centre where there is no fog, slowly watching the fog close in on me as the smell of salt water becomes nearly unbearable, as the sense of drowning washing over me. Within moments the fog is nearly upon me and the dread in my heart is nearly at an apex, until I hear a large blaring horn and headlights quickly rushing towards me, and I noticed that the woman who was acting strange was shouting for me to get in as she slammed on next to me. Within moments I dived in the car and began to hyperventilate, as once the door was slammed shut, all I could hear was the revving of an engine and the banging of hundreds of hands on the glass and metal of the car as the woman slammed on the accelerator and began to tear out the area heading to my house. Bursting through the door with the woman in tow, I slammed the door shut and dragged her away from the windows. Within moments of us entering my house, the panes of glass that was in the windows explode in as we were showered in glass, as the doors of the house rattle and bang constantly. Within moments of the attack commencing, it stopped, and the air around the house went silent as the woman looked at me and sighed in relief as she shook her head and began to speak. I was a friend of your grandmother, and when I saw you bringing that piece of paper, it completely shook me to my core, the woman explained, as I sat there just staring at her as I handed her the other handwritten notes as her eyes widened. These messages tell you what I am about to explain to you. The town, many years ago, was a boom town for the fishing economy, and many people came to work as there wasn't much work in the local area at that time. With that, the fate of most boom towns quickly happened, and the fish dried up, and so did the money. The town quickly fell into financial trouble, and one day a rumour was spinning around the fishermen that a boat with a large amount of money would be passing the channel that our lighthouse protected, as without the lighthouse many boats wouldn't see the rocks that sprouted out from the water. The mayor collected the town's influential characters and discussed the rumour in detail. Our mayor wasn't the most respectful person and suggested to the others that they turn off the light of the lighthouse and allow the boat to crash, and then they could reap the rewards and pay off the debts and keep the town afloat, or they would have to abandon the town they worked so hard to keep. The woman spoke. My heart dropped out, but before I could speak once more, she continued. Then there were many objections from the influential people, but after a lot of arguing, they conceded in the fact that the house and the towns would go under if they didn't do something about the debt. They agreed with the mayor's crazy plan. The only member of the town who needed to agree didn't, and that person the mayor saw personally. That person was obviously the lighthouse keeper. He didn't want to risk that many lives just for money and wouldn't allow the mayor to turn off the light of the lighthouse on the day of the storm. As I said, the mayor wasn't a good man to start with, but the thought of becoming increasingly wealthy, he did the unthinkable. And when the lighthouse keeper went to the top of the lighthouse to have a cigarette, the mayor came up from behind him and pushed him from the top of the lighthouse, killing him on the rocks below. So, as the time came, the boat crashed on the rocks and the townspeople collected its spoils, and the town was saved. But at what cost? After a few years, each night the fog began to appear and people began to go missing, and then a few days later they would be found dead on the beach from drowning. We did everything to try and stop this curse. We even gave all the gold back to the shipwreck, as most of it didn't even get spent, but I guess that wasn't enough to appease the spirits who now hunger for our lives. The woman sat down and just cried, as the truth must have weighed heavy on her soul, but with that weight released, she felt relieved. I just stood up and brought back the pendant that I now found was in my jacket pocket. The moment her eyes landed on the pendant, she screamed in terror and shock. "How did you get that?" Her voice raised in fear and terror as I told her I found it as I moved some old furniture. "That is part of the treasure from the boat. It was never fully recovered. We never gave it all back. You need to..." With that said, I stood up and rushed outside and ran down the road as the fog surrounded me instantly as I looked around while holding the pendant in my hand. I shouted out into the fog, "Come and get your gold. Leave the souls of the living alone." But with that said, the fog just got thicker and thicker as it surrounded me until a figure appeared in the mist. It shimmered and rippled and only stood meters away. I could see the coral on its clothing, where the places its bones could be seen through its tears in its clothing also. It shambled towards me and stopped a few feet away as the fog surrounded us, leaving nothing but a wall of white. I could easily see the rot on his waterlogged skin as the sea salt made my eyes water as I held out the hand as the pendant dangled in the air. The shimmering figure looked down at the pendant and held out its hand. As I slowly dropped the pendant into its palm, it vanished into its palm as the image begins to ripple as I have just thrown a pebble into a body of a still pond. Within seconds of the rippling figure looking at me, it slowly vanished from sight as the fog slowly dissipated into the sea once more. I thought it was over. I thought I did the right thing. The next day I travelled home to the city where I was born, and after a few days with my mother, I went to the store and picked up a newspaper like I always do, and once I read the headline of the paper, I nearly vomited on the floor right there and then. It read, "Coastal Mystery. Everyone in town missing." And the image was a satellite view of the coastal town I was in days before, and in my mind I knew that in a few days there would be bodies washing up on the shore of the town. After seeing the headline, I placed that house on the market and not planning to go back anytime soon. Did I do the right thing in giving the pendant back? Or did I doom the town to a fate that was long time coming? Hi guys, this is Kindarous. Thanks for watching, and all I want to say is if you want a part 2 to any of these videos of The Confessions of a Hunter or this story, if I get 50 views, I will do a part 2. So, I would like you to subscribe, to comment, and to like. It really does help in the YouTube algorithm. So, this is Kindarous, signing off. See you next time.